Even as the first shadows were felt in Mirkwood, there appeared in the west of Middle-earth the Istari, whom men called the Wizards. None knew at that time whence they were, save Círdan of the Havens, and only to Elrond and to Galadriel did he reveal that they came over the sea. But afterwards it was said among the elves that they were messengers sent by the Lords of the West to contest the power of Sauron, if he should arise again, and to move elves and men and all living things of good will to valiant deeds. Hello Tolkien geeks! Today's video is the continuation of my video essay on Gandalf, the Order of the Wizards, and magic in Middle-earth. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe and hit the bell icon button if you're new to the channel. The first part to this essay focused on the meta-history of wizards in the Legendarium. Questions like, what were Tolkien's influences? And how did the development of the wizards, through the published works, affect the representation of magic in Middle-earth? Today we will have a rundown of the in-universe history of the Order of the Wizards prior to the events of The Lord of the Rings. We'll examine their nature a little further and also ask some plot-related questions, like how was Saruman able to fool the Council for so long? When and how was he corrupted? And what did Gandalf see in the hobbits that gave him reason to spend so much of his time in the Shire? As we learnt last time, the Istari were chosen by the Valar, from the ranks of the Maiar of Valinor, to provide aid and guidance to the peoples of Middle-earth. The fact that the Valar would delegate the task of defending the Outer Lands from the evil of Sauron to their subordinates, basically, is indicative of a change in their strategy, based upon the lessons learned in the previous two ages. The first age ended with the expulsion of Melkor, Sauron's old master, into the void. But it came at the great expense of the destruction of the lands of Beleriand in the northwest of the continent. Similarly, the Second Age coincided with the destruction of Númenor and the reshaping of the flat world into a sphere. Although we have no account of the deliberations of the Valar after Sauron was vanquished temporarily at the end of the Second Age, clearly, the Valar were attempting to avoid the kind of widespread collateral damage which the previous conflicts had resulted in, as a consequence of the errors they had made. And so they took a more subtle approach, and sent their agents across the sea to act as messengers, forbidden to rule over others, or reveal themselves in their true forms. In all accounts of the origins of the wizards, it was said that the first chosen was Curumo, who was known in Middle-earth as Saruman. And Tolkien's notes indicate that he was chosen for the task by the Valar who was known to the elves by the name Aule the Smith. This fits with what we know of Saruman. His name was a translation of Man of Skill. He was a maker, who was chiefly concerned with acquiring knowledge and constructing devices with which to combat Sauron. Aule's servants have a bad track record when it comes to turning to evil. The Silmarillion tells us that Sauron himself was originally one of the people of Aule, just as Saruman was. They probably even knew one another in the days before Sauron, who was originally called Mairon, was corrupted by Melkor during the earliest ages of the world. Feanor and the Noldor were corrupted in Valinor in part by that same introduction to industry and the danger that it represents, when Melkor taught them to craft weapons, and they learned to wield them. I would argue that this reflects badly on those who are makers or sub-creators, rather than on Aule himself, whose character is certainly not like that of Melkor, but certainly it is no coincidence. Saruman was joined by Alatar, who was said to have been a Maya of Arome the Hunter. Christopher Tolkien speculates that the reasoning here was that Arome had explored Middle-earth more extensively than the other Valar, and Alatar went into the far east of the continent. A sensible deduction in my view. With him went his friend Palondo, and together these two were known as the Blue Wizards. At least in one version of the story. In another later version, Tolkien wrote that the Blue Wizards were in fact the earliest arrivals to Middle-earth of all the wizards, arriving millennia earlier, around the year 1600 of the Second Age, which was right around the time of the forging of the One Ring, and also when Glorfindel was said to have returned. Perhaps they all shared a boat. In this revised narrative, we are told that the Blue Wizards had some measure of success in their fight against Sauron in the south and east, in stark contrast to the earlier tales, which even include a suggestion that the two of them established magical cults in the east and went fully rogue. The later version designates two completely new names to the two mystery wizards as well, Morenitar and Romastamo. There have been many theories that we will see an adaptation of this version of their story in the forthcoming Amazon Prime series set in the Second Age. In truth, the source material tells us little about them. These two competing and mutually exclusive storylines illustrate the complexity in trying to discern the true canon version of events in Tolkien's works, at least in some areas of the lore. In general, it is often customary to go with the later writings, except for when they contradict published works. We'll try to cut through the ambiguity as much as possible in this history, but this is always something to bear in mind. In any case, sources do indicate that Eowendil, who was known in Middle-earth as Radagast, was sent across the sea at the bidding of Yavanna, the wife of Aule, and that Radagast was her servant. The relationship between Aule and Yavanna has a kind of duality to it, which we see in Chapter 2 of the Silmarillion. There, Aule created the dwarven race in secret, and Eru Ilúvatar, the one god of Tolkien's mythology, after some reprimanding, accepts Aule's children and uses the flame imperishable to give them life. Yavanna responds by demanding that Manwë do something to counteract the violence that this new race may inflict upon the natural world. And it is revealed that, recalling the music that the two of them sang together during the formation of Arda in the Ainulindalë, the Ents and the great eagles will enter the world after the awakening of the elves. That these two godlike beings would represent opposing forces in such a way is a satisfying explanation for Radagast's inclusion in the Order of the Wizards, as a counter to Aule's sponsorship of Saruman. That kind of duality on a cosmic, cosmogonical scale feels very mythic and appropriately abstract. Yavanna and Aule represent the creative elements of nature and engineering, respectively. They have creation, or rather subcreation as Tolkien would have it, in common with one another, despite having at times agendas which are very much in opposition. Gandalf's inclusion in the Istari also has several different backstories attached to it. The essay on the Istari that we referenced several times in Part 1 contested that he was the only wizard who had remained faithful, and that Saruman betrayed his order, while Radagast is, perhaps a little unfairly, criticised for his apparent apathy towards the very important matter of opposing Sauron. Gandalf's name among the elves of Middle-earth and in Gondor is Mithrandir, which translates to Grey Pilgrim, Gandalf the Grey. The colour grey seems to be of almost sacred importance to Tolkien. Aragorn's eyes are described as grey on many occasions, most often combined with the adjective keen, including the very first time Frodo notices him in the common room of the Prancing Pony. This detail establishes Aragorn's connection to the elves as the great elf friend of his time, and of his Númenórean lineage, which is descended from elfkind, though we don't know that yet when we meet him in Bree. Elrond's eyes are described similarly in Rivendell when Frodo sees him for the first time. His eyes were grey as a clear evening, and in them was a light like the light of stars. Anyway, this raises the question of what exactly the colours which were attributed to each wizard were supposed to signify. The two most obvious answers to that question are either rank or a job role, like a kind of academic area of study. I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on this in the comments below, because there are certainly merits to both of these arguments. After arriving in Middle-earth, the wizards kept a low profile for many centuries, putting aside the vague and contradictory accounts of the activities of the Blue Wizards. The first event of real note concerning them occurred in 2063, when Gandalf the Grey journeyed to Dol Guldur in Mirkwood to investigate reports of an evil that had arisen there. He was successful in driving out the entity known only as the Necromancer for a time, but he was unable to discover his true nature yet at this point in history. And afterwards followed almost 4 centuries of what was known as the Watchful Peace. In 2463, the White Council was formed in response to the return of evil in Mirkwood. Technically, this was the Second White Council, after the council which had existed during the Second Age, and it was called to session by Galadriel, and was attended by Gandalf, Saruman, Elrond, Círdan the Shipwright, and other unnamed elf lords, potentially Glorfindel, though we can't prove that. Galadriel recommends that Gandalf be appointed the head of the council, but he refuses the office based upon his disinterest in affiliating himself with any particular hierarchy, and a desire to remain an independent operator. Tolkien disliked the pursuit of leadership as a character trait intensely, which formed part of his distaste for politics, and he cited the medieval precept of nolo episcopari, that's Latin, not Elvish, which is the traditional ritual refusal made by a cleric of Tolkien's Catholic faith, a refusal of an offer to take the office of a bishop. Tolkien sees Gandalf's actions in refusing to preside over the White Council as a virtuous character trait, one which makes him worthy of leadership. Saruman has no such compunctions about the role when offered it, but we are told that he holds a grudge against the other members of the council forever after for preferring Gandalf as a leader, and particularly against Galadriel, having grown both prideful and ambitious. I commented during the first part of this video essay on the way in which the Istari, in their incarnate forms, were subject to human weaknesses on account of their material bodies. My contention here would be that Saruman's weakness of ego is a more spiritual one, unaffected by the weakness of the human form in the way that the essay on the Istari from Unfinished Tales contends. But I'd be interested in hearing more from others on this issue, on the fuzzy borders between spirituality and psychology, and how it relates to the moral choices of characters in The Lord of the Rings. Again, let me know what you think of Saruman's corruption in the comments, and what it says about his own nature, and the forms that the wizards have taken. The year 2758 of the Third Age, almost 3 centuries after the formation of the White Council, was the year of the Long Winter. As the name indicates, the Long Winter was an extremely long and unpleasant winter which Middle-earth experienced that year, which affected most of the map. In Rohan, the Dunlendings attacked, and King Helm Hammerhand was forced to retreat to the fortress of the Hornburg. This was when it received its better-known name of Helm's Deep. In Gondor, the Corsairs of Umbar and the Haradrim took advantage of the situation in Rohan by launching an invasion. But the winter also affected the north very strongly indeed, and there was widespread death and suffering in Eriador, including in the Shire. It was at this time that Gandalf first befriended the hobbits. He was struck by their endurance and their selfless natures, and by the robustness of hobbit society. But more than that, he began to see untapped potential in them. In the years that followed, and right up until the War of the Ring and the end of the Third Age, Gandalf visited the Shire frequently, and he would often whisk young hobbits away on some adventure or another. This was how his long association with the Took family began, Bilbo's mother's family. For those interested in that topic, I have a video on the history of the Took family, which was released for Hobbit Day last year. In the year following the Long Winter, the Steward of Gondor, one Beren at that time, that's no relation to the Beren in the Silmarillion, granted the keys to the Tower of Orthanc to Saruman the White. According to Appendix A of The Lord of the Rings, his hope was that the wizard would help to heal the hurts of the Rohirrim after the invasion of the Dunlendings the previous year. As Saruman took up residence in Isengard, in the years that followed, Gandalf began to spend more and more time in the Shire, but he continued to travel into Wilderland, and possibly even beyond. It was when Thrain, Thorin's father, went missing that Gandalf entered and explored the abandoned realm of Khazad-dûm in 2845 to look for the Dwarven King. The search continued for 5 years, but finally ended when Gandalf entered Dol Guldur a second time and discovered Thrain in Sauron's dungeons. This was when the necromancer's true identity was discovered, and also when Thrain gave Gandalf the map of Erebor and the key to open the hidden passage which Bilbo uses to gain access to the mountain in The Hobbit. Gandalf travelled straight to Rivendell after leaving Sauron's dungeons, and a meeting of the White Council was called. Gandalf argued for an immediate attack on Dol Guldur, but Saruman declared that the One Ring had been lost, and that Sauron was powerless as a result. Saruman told the council that he believed that the ring had rolled down the river into the ocean. Saruman, in his time in Middle-earth, had established himself as the foremost expert in ring lore amongst the wise. The reason that Gandalf and the others accepted his argument was that he had authority on this particular subject, and had been the primary source of their own knowledge on the subject until now. Saruman was trusted, and when he speaks on the subject of the Rings of Power, others follow. And his argument makes sense on several levels. There is precedence for what Saruman is saying here. Silmarillion readers will know that at the end of the First Age, Maglor, son of Feanor, throws one of the 3 Silmarils into the ocean, and it remains lost forever after. The implication seems to be that the Valar Olmo, the Lord of Waters, is safekeeping the Silmaril at the bottom of the ocean. And this, furthermore, is a story which Elrond at least would be intimately familiar with, as Maglor was the foster father to he and his brother Elros after the twin brothers were separated from their parents. And so Saruman won the debate, and the spirit of Sauron continued to grow in power and potency. Saruman, of course, unbeknownst to the others, had begun to lust after the ring for himself. Another council meeting was held in 2941, and the same debate was repeated, but this time Saruman relented. The reason for this change was that 2 years prior he had learnt that Sauron was actively searching the Anduin, which indicated that the Dark Lord had discovered that Isildur was killed in the vicinity of the Gladden Fields, next to the river. However, Saruman kept his own counsel, still hoping to retrieve the ring for his own ends. Gandalf, meanwhile, was planning a move of his own to take the dragon Smaug off of the table, preventing a future alliance with Sauron in the process, and bolstering the societies and old alliances in northern Rhovanion, the setting where The Hobbit takes place. The main thread of events surely don't bear repeating here. In the course of the journey of Thorin Oakenshield's company to reclaim their ancestral home of Erebor, Gandalf leaves the dwarves and teams up with the White Council to try to take down Sauron, as they agreed at the meeting. As I explained in the previous video, this encounter is only mentioned in the vaguest of terms in The Hobbit itself. The events of Peter Jackson's Hobbit adaptations were almost entirely fabricated by New Line Cinema's screenwriters. There is no detailed account of the battle anywhere in Tolkien's published works. We do know that in the aftermath of the assault, however, Sauron retreats to Mordor, and Dol Guldur is deserted for a time. Eventually, evil returns to Dol Guldur, and in the run-up to the War of the Ring, the ancient fortress is inhabited by the Ringwraith, Khamûl the Easterling. Peace returned to Middle-earth for a time following the Battle of Five Armies, but Sauron persisted, and, while he survived, the task of Gandalf and the other wizards was not complete. Saruman had begun to lust after the ring for himself and was still leading the resistance against Sauron. The ring, of course, had been recovered by Bilbo during the quest of Erebor. Immediately following the Hobbit's return to the Shire, Gandalf begins to worry privately about the mystery of the ring. As he later says to Frodo, one fateful morning in the study at Bag End, "It was in the year that the White Council drove the Dark Power from Mirkwood, just before the Battle of Five Armies, that Bilbo found his ring. A shadow fell on my heart then, though I did not know yet what I feared. I wondered often how Gollum came by a great ring, as plainly it was. That at least was clear from the first. Then I heard Bilbo's strange story of how he had won it, and I could not believe it." Sauron declared himself openly 10 years after the quest of Erebor, and 2 years after that, in 2953, the White Council met for the final time. Saruman once again voices his claim that the One Ring was lost at the bottom of the sea, and was safe from the Dark Lord, which calms Gandalf's fears about Bilbo's ring for a while. Thinking about this from Gandalf's perspective, it may be that Saruman had hinted at a kind of communique from the Valar on the matter. If he had implied through his speech here that he had received some message from Manwë or from Ulmo, then that would be enough for Gandalf. It was at this time that Saruman's slide into evil ways really begins to start taking a more active form. Saruman's jealousy of Gandalf overwhelms him, and he begins to keep a very close watch on his counterpart's activities, installing spies in the Shire and in Bree, where Gandalf was known to spend a great deal of his time. Saruman's mind did not work the same way that Gandalf's did, and his actions simply did not compute. The Silmarillion tells us that Gandalf's time in Valinor in his youth took him often to the house of Nienna, and of her he learned pity and patience. It was fitting then that Gandalf learned of the ways of hobbits through his sense of mercy and compassion. Saruman's pride would soon get the better of him in the year 3000, when he dares to look into the Palantir of Orthanc, the seeing stone of the Númenóreans who built the tower itself. The seeing stones were crafted by Feanor long ago in the Years of the Trees, and gifted to the Númenóreans later. The kings installed them in key locations in the realms of Gondor and Arnor, until they were lost one by one over the course of time, and passed into legend. Saruman must surely have realised that there was a very strong possibility that the stone had been seized by Sauron when his lieutenant the Witch King captured Minas Ithil, and so he was taking a deliberate, reckless risk by looking into the Orthanc stone and challenging the Dark Lord. There is a certain kind of hysterical paranoia about Saruman, even early on in his career. It seems that he kept his own counsel on the Seeing Stones, just as he did with his knowledge of the rings. The essay on the Palantiri in Unfinished Tales indicates that Saruman knew or suspected that the stone was still intact in Orthanc when he received the keys back in 2759. His jealousy of Gandalf played its part here, and so he never informed the council of his possession of the Orthanc stone. Unfinished Tales also tells us that it is likely, based on what we learn of him, that Denethor dared to use the Arnor stone long before Saruman looked into the stone of Orthanc, which indicates that for a long time Saruman didn't find the use of the stone to be worth the risk. It may have been his desperation over a general lack of knowledge on the ring which drove him to finally look into the Palantir, and when he did so, he became subject to the will of Sauron, and betrayed the council. And now, since the next event of note on the timeline of events is Bilbo's 11th birthday, an event which no doubt most of you are familiar with, we have reached the end of this breakdown. I had planned for this to be the conclusion of this investigation of Tolkien's wizards, but in the course of writing this one, I have decided that I shall release one final bonus video where we will take a selective look at some of Saruman and Gandalf's decisions during the War of the Ring. If you have any burning, unresolved questions about Gandalf or Saruman's actions in the main storyline to The Lord of the Rings, leave your suggestions in the comments below. Make sure you have the bell icon button turned on, and look out for that conclusion in the coming weeks.